Great. Well, I'm really impressed to see everybody up at 8 o'clock in the morning to hear about some socioeconomics in the Redwood region. My name's Erin Kelly, as you said, and this presentation was prepared with Chelsea MacGyver of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at University of Montana and Rick Standiford. And the purpose of the talk is to kind of characterize broadly some of the socioeconomics in the region. And this was really, for me, an opportunity to explore some data sets and start to identify gaps and see what information we had and what information we didn't have related to certain questions about the economy in the region. So I'm going to talk first about general socioeconomics, and I'm going to divide the Redwood region into northern and southern counties, probably for obvious reasons to people here, but northern counties being more rural, having more vibrant timber industry, and southern Redwood counties being more metropolitan and primarily valuing trees for recreation and open space purposes. And these data are mostly from federal data sources like the U.S. Census, U.S. Department of Commerce, and they're compiled through a group at Montana State called Headwaters Economics. I'm going to talk a little bit about land ownership data, so who owns land in these regions, and then finally forest industry. In particular, look at some harvesting trends and regional capacity and changes over time. So in trying to define what the Redwood region was for the conference, all these counties have some redwood acres, but I decided to focus on counties that had more than 5% redwood acres as a land base. And so the northern counties are Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocino. The southern counties are Sonoma, San Mateo, and Santa Cruz. And so a lot of the data that I'll be presenting, I kind of divide by northern and southern counties. And just as a little context for this socioeconomic data, the Redwood region is part of what could be termed the New West. And so a lot of these changes that we see are common across the western United States. There are economic changes where we've moved from depending on commodity markets and really valuing natural capital to valuing human capital. So sectors based on people's knowledge, skills, and innovation. There's also in-migration to a lot of these counties based on amenity values. I won't be talking about that today. But I'll focus some on altered human-land relationships. So there's this move from treating landscapes as extractive resources to largely consumptive resources, so focusing on aesthetic and recreational values of the resources. And I think you see a lot of these trends in the Redwood region. Let's get that. One place that you see this is where people are working. So this graph is just it conveys some of the information about service sector versus non-service sector. And so the blue bars are service-related sectors, so employment in those sectors. And that includes not just like retail and restaurants, it includes finance, real estate, insurance, so high-paying service sector jobs. And what you see is that over time, those sectors have grown, but also that the southern counties have a greater proportion of service sector jobs. And that kind of makes sense if you include insurance and real estate and finance. The non-service related jobs are declining, and this includes agriculture and forestry. And so if you were to look at the northern counties, for example, just in the forest industries, if you start there in 2001, you're going from about 7% down to less than about 3% in forest industries. And so you see a decline in these non-service sector industries and a rise in service sector industries. One place that you really see a bifurcation between the northern and southern counties is in education. So if what we're valuing is kind of human capital and people's knowledge and skills, you can see that the southern counties have a real advantage. And so to look at this, the dark bars are high school or less. So the percent of the population that has high school or less education. The light bars are associate's degree or more, so people who have at least some college education or more. And Humboldt County, Mendocino, and Del Norte, you see really high levels of, some pointer? No. You see high levels of people who just have high school or less. And in Sonoma, San Mateo, and Santa Cruz counties, you see a lot of people with college degrees, or at least some college education, and the U.S. is in between. And so what you see is that there's kind of a nice illustration of the southern counties being on one side, the northern counties being on the other in terms of human capital. One thing that kind of surprised me as we were looking through some of these data sets at the federal level is that, as you might expect, earnings per job are higher in the southern counties. And these data are all real data, so they're adjusted for inflation to 2015 dollars. But if you go back to about 1970, the earnings per job in the southern counties and the northern counties were very close. And so what you see here is actually just a loss of those high-paying blue-collar jobs. This transition from a commodity to a more human-based economy. And so the average earnings per job in the southern counties have really risen, and they've stagnated in the northern counties. And the per capita income has grown in both. I'm going to skip that, but if you have questions about non-labor income, we can go back to this slide as well. But I'm going to transition to land ownership, partly because this area for the western U.S. is pretty unusual. Really, the Redwood region is primarily privately owned, and if you look across the U.S., this is not the case. Del Norte County is the one exception, but you have a tremendous amount of privately held lands in most of the counties of the Redwood region. And of course, these lands look different. There's more forest in the northern counties and more grassland and shrubland in the southern counties, but overall, you have a lot of private lands. And if you just consider the private lands, you have a real trend of development, enormous development. So even though there's a lot of open space in these counties, what you have here is urban and suburban development. So that's up to 1.7 acres. And then exurban development. So this is dispersed development from about 1.7 to 40 acres. And if you look at Santa Cruz County, it's over 60% of the county is in some sort of dispersed human development. And so Bill Stewart described this as having a redwood forest with an understory of houses. And that's really what it is. And you see that it's actually much larger than the U.S. as a whole. We have actually an immense amount of exurban development, so parcelization from large ownerships to smaller and smaller. So I'm going to turn now towards forest industry data, and a lot of these data are from Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana. They actually do a phone survey of producers in the region. They actually do a phone survey of timber producers across the entire western U.S. And they put out great reports of these, but they've never dialed in, like focused in on one region. So what we did is we drew a boundary around what we called the Redwood region and just said what's happening to the timber industry or the forest products industry in this area. And we also pulled some data from the California Board of Equalization and some Forest Service data. So it's very expected that the timber harvest in this area has declined. So if you go back to 78 to 2015, both the North counties and South counties have declined, and of course the North counties have long harvested a lot more timber. And this is expected. I mean, we've all seen this. I wanted to just provide a little bit of context in terms of the state. If you look at the state as a whole, the Redwood region has provided a lot of the timber in the state, somewhere between a low of 21% and a high of 40% over the years. So the Redwood region is still providing a lot of the timber in a just declining harvest across the state. So you do see some of this reflected in the processing capacity of the region. And so these are from surveys of mills in the area. And what you see is a decline in total capacity. So this is going back to 1988 when they started doing these surveys. And you also see that the capacity utilized is less than the total capacity. So if there's still a mill there and it's idle or it's not producing to its full capacity, you see the orange bar reflecting that. And so, for example, in 2009 with the economic crisis, you still had mills there. They just weren't producing to their full capacity. And so I'm going to look at these last few years where it kind of looks stagnant in a way. In terms of primary production capacity, it hasn't been stagnant. And so these data just show, it's kind of a snapshot to look at where the mills are actually still operating. If you look over at 2006, you see the mills operating as of 2006. In 2012, you see them start to close, so the red dots are closed mills. And then we updated this for 2016 and just tried to get at where those mills are also idle or just partially running. And some of the partially, well, one of the partially running mills was only running like a month of the year. So some of the capacity is really declining even though the mills might physically still be there. And of course we combined the whole Redwood region for this because there's not a lot of production capacity in the southern region. So in terms of what these mills are producing, this is a little bit confusing at first glance, but the light blue bar is the timber that is harvested and processed in the region. The dark blue bar are this is the amount of timber that's coming in, and this is a million board feet across the bottom, of domestic imports. Now the way we did this, again, is we drew a line around the Redwood region, and so domestic imports could be from Weaverville. It's anything that's coming out of the region into the region. And then the domestic exports out of the region there are a pretty small sliver. So most of the timber that is harvested here is processed here. And there's, so you see a declining level of harvest, declining processing capacity, and declining domestic imports into the region. If you look at then the actual timber, where it's coming from in terms of land ownership, I divided this into northern and southern counties, and most of it is coming from industry in the northern counties. This probably makes sense. There's a lot of industry-held land. There's a significant component from tribal lands, and you do see the dark green is other public. That's mostly state forest, and you see it. There's no harvest in 2006 from the state forest. I think when Jackson Demonstration State Forest was closed, not harvesting. But one thing that's interesting about the southern counties, and of course this is much less timber that they're harvesting, but a lot more as a proportion is coming from these non-industrial landowners. And that makes sense if you think about their land ownership as a whole bunch of little 40-acre plots and some slightly larger. They're having a lot of harvest from non-industrial private forest landowners. One question we had, that we weren't able to get at through some of the mill data, was how much is actually just being exported out of the country. And we looked around for some of these data. This is from production, price, employment, and trade data from the Forest Service. You can't definitively say that this is Redwood region, but it does have the ports of Eureka and Oakland, and so we think this kind of reflects some of the trends of where timber is going and how much timber is leaving the country, and as raw logs, as log exports. And so this is million board feet. And what you see here is that in the 90s, Japan was a huge export market. There was probably high-value timber at that time. And then China was coming online. Other countries, this is primarily Korea and Taiwan. There's not a lot of exports to, like, Europe. It totally bottomed out, though, with the Asian financial crisis. And then what you see more recently, and a lot of people have seen this in selling logs, is that China has really come back in a big way, whereas Japan and other countries have not. And so China is really buying a lot of whitewoods at this point, so kind of low-value timber that's coming out of these ports. And again, we can't say that this is all from the Redwood region, but this probably reflects a lot of trends of this region as well. So in terms of the socioeconomic data, I mean, probably it's kind of obvious. I chose the two parts of the Redwood region because I knew they would contrast a lot, but they have really different levels of human and financial capital. The big caveat here, of course, is that the northern counties in particular, there's an enormous gray or shadow industry, right? So a lot of that data, we can't pick up how much is coming from like the marijuana industry. And so it's just invisible to census data at this point. You can pick up the secondary and tertiary parts of that sector, but you're not getting at all the growers who are out there who are agricultural producers. Both of the regions have more and more service sector jobs, and this is probably going to continue. You're going to have more and more service sector jobs, fewer ag, fewer forestry jobs, potentially, although I'm looking forward to the talk later about that. There's decreasing non-service sector, and then the Redwood region does display some of those characteristics of the New West, although we don't actually have rapid immigration. The population growth in this area relative to the rest of the West is actually very slow. And I'm not sure why that is, but even in the southern region, it's been relatively slow. The land ownership is largely privately held relative to the rest of the American West, and the southern counties have this really extensive exurban and suburban development. Both parts of the region have declining mill capacity, which you would expect, and declining harvest levels, but most of the harvested wood is processed in the region, and you see this kind of uptick in export markets. But those export markets are still a relatively small proportion of the overall market, forest products market. So in collecting these data, one thing we were thinking is, kind of, okay, here's a characterization of the region. It's kind of a first step. I'd like to pursue some of these with a kind of more nuanced view of local level trends. So this has been done in the Sierras, for example. If you look at county level data, you're really ignoring a lot of the distinctions between kind of more isolated parts of counties, like in Humboldt County, and more urban parts like Eureka. There's a lot of uncertainty around timber jobs, and comparing, especially as you get to a smaller and smaller level, some of the census data and even state data get less and less precise. And finally, I think there's a real need to characterize other forestry jobs. Nobody's kind of gotten a handle on things like how many people are working in restoration, and I think that the restoration industry is actually pretty large and contributes quite a lot to the economy of these areas. We still kind of tend to see forestry jobs as like forest sector jobs. And so that's kind of a next step for some of these data. And with that, I think I'm done.